So welcome back to the next episode of the Legal Meth Lab, where we start to demystify some of the various elements of innovation and methodology and discipline that are being used in the industry. Today's episode, we're going to be talking a little bit about quality. And this is quite interesting, Jay, how it follows on from the conversations we were having about value last episode. Given quality is subjective, how do you go about creating a universally accepted definition of it within your projects?
Quite difficult, actually, to do that. Taking a step back for a second, when we mean by subjective, I think it'd be worth just pointing out what we mean when we say that, or when I say that anyway. So subjectivity around quality in the same way as value is that when you think about quality, you've got two sides to it. So you look at, especially in the legal service, if you take a lawyer, for example, their view on quality will be potentially gold Rolls Royce service. You know, they want to be able to do the best thing they possibly can and to put their seal of approval on something because it's a profession, it's advice, it's something that's against their name. Whereas the other side of it is the level of quality expectations from a client can be completely different. They may not want gold Rolls Royce services. You know, bronze might be enough. What is it that they need? And there's first of all, a difference between those two worlds, and to bring them together from a design perspective. So there's two lenses I can place on this throughout this conversation. One is on this design lens, which is just getting one side to understand the other and to bring the empathy into that conversation, or saying, you produce this, which is fantastic, but you're overproducing something that you don't necessarily do. You're over-engineering something that you don't necessarily need to. And there's a huge ego tussle with themselves and others in that conversation, but defining something in that realm is quite important to do so, because otherwise everybody's expectation of quality is very different, and you'll all be sort of shooting at different targets, which is a nightmare for if you're ever going to try and move forward with something. On the other side of it, when we look at definitions, you can look at it from a statistical angle. So quality will tell you something factually based on data. So in the Lean Six Sigma world, or in the total quality management world, there's a number of different names for the same bunch of stuff, really. You can use, statistical process control charts that, you can track data, or you can, against particular processes, place on what we call a DPMO, which is a defects per million opportunities, which will tell you the factual level of quality a process has or a procedure has, which is how many times does this go wrong every million times we produce it. And the Six Sigma element is something that goes wrong every 3.4 parts per million. So every, million you produce, only 3.4 go wrong, which people aim at trying to be Six Sigma. And in a service world, that's nigh on impossible for people to do. I mean, good luck if you have. But because we've got humans in there, we've got a tendency to make errors. As much as we like to think we don't, we do. So we need to sort of set expectations around, we're not going to aim for absolute perfection. We'll try and get there. But what we need to do is, on B, is realistic around the expectations of what quality is and what's expected from quality. And how you define that is entirely dependent on different projects, different processes, different products that you'll potentially produce.
Thanks, Jay. Nicole, I'm curious from your perspective, quality can be defined as fitness for purpose, and touching on sort of what Jay's alluded to with the balance between minimum viable product and that value equation for customer satisfaction. How do you observe the balance between those two elements? And are you seeing a drive for minimum viable product? Do people understand what that means? Or is it very ambiguous, the kind of client definition of quality?
Yeah, and I'll again state that my job is a lot easier than Jay's in the product world. Sort of identifying quality and striving for quality is much more clean cut for us, right? So when we're looking at a quality product, it's A, does it meet the goal that the client set out in the beginning? B, is it done with good craftsmanship? Is it relatively bug free? Is it free of all critical bugs? 4, does it follow basic UX heuristics? There are very easy ways for us to determine if our product's quality. On the MVP front, I actually think that in legal, it is very challenging to release a truly minimally viable product, or at least the definition of what is viable is a bit further down the line than it would be in other industries. because there are so many things where if the product is always designed to put the user in a better position, but if there are items that are lacking or missing that would complete the context of the legal issue, or if we somehow muddy things because we're not being thorough because we have something that delivers some value, we could risk putting people in a worse position than they were before they used the product. So I don't think it's really the clients that have a hard time with MVP, although we do generally have to say, like, you don't need every bell and whistle. We don't need everything, every sort of flashy thing here. But there is a point where you have to say, is this enough to ensure that we're doing more good than harm?
You do see that in the gaming industry as well, actually, because we take big releases of games, so like Bethesda. So I'm making a complete parallel example here, but you're seeing MVBs taken to the extreme the other way, where they're releasing something that's not quite ready. So where the good enough model is actually being taken to actually not good enough anymore. So like there's been a whole bunch of media fallout with the Fallout 76 line. So it's a very popular gaming line, is Fallout as a franchise, and it's been absolutely smashed in the media and its fans and its community base for actually producing something that's not ready. It hasn't got not necessarily the bells and whistles, but just the core fundamentals of what they've expected. And I'm hoping that trend doesn't eke into other industries now, where the good enough falls into being not good enough, and people try and move too quickly and miss certain goals just because they believe that it's all to do with finances or being first to market or whatever that may be. There's still a stamp, there's still a stake in the ground that what is good enough, and what are the principles that we need to stick by here.
I think when people talk about MVPs, they're usually referring to something that is fully releasable to the public. And I think that we can make MVPs, put them in sort of private testing and get the learning. I mean, the whole point of an MVP is to get something out and learn in order to do the rest. You can do that without having a public release. So, if you have a controlled group, we do a lot of disclaimers when we're testing, early versions of products around, like, do not consider this complete legal information. Don't rely on what's here. Oftentimes we'll have a lawyer in the room so that if the user has extra questions beyond what the application can currently do, there's a lawyer there so that we don't get them stuck in a situation where the experience they've had on this sort of MVP or this early release of this application, where they confuse that for being like the full story. So we just have to be pretty careful about that.
So I'm curious, with these validation and acceptance mechanisms that you've got, like testing and quality assurance checking that you do, what are your sort of top tips for that engagement process? Because you've alluded to the fact that it's an experience, right, for the end user, and we want to balance the benefits of testing and acceptance of the solution with not putting it in front of them too soon.
Yeah, I mean, I think that having a conversation with the user before, if you're doing actual, validation testing of a product as opposed to just user interviews, we have a conversation with them before we even start about, like, setting the scene of, like, this is not something that's complete. We have like a script that we run through to make sure that the user fully understands that this is a test scenario and that nothing is to be considered sort of real and accurate. So that, for the most part, works well, particularly if we're working with lawyers as users. But when we're working with consumers as users, we're a lot more careful when we do that. And that's, allowing them to have follow up with a lawyer or whatever to sort of get to the bottom of their issue. So it quite depends on who we're testing with.
You've also mentioned the reference to defining the quality criteria and the importance of getting that right up front. Are there any good tools in the marketplace that you've seen that you use to help do that?
So, yeah, I mean, I think the type of quality criteria that we do at the outset of a project is really defining, from an accessibility standpoint, what standards we're trying to meet. And we have an internal checklist to make sure that whatever those standards are, that we're meeting them. And so our quality assurance engineers will run through that in addition to running through basic, automated testing of the application and manual testing. As far as sort of user experience, yeah, I mean, there's the Nielsen-Norman group sort of sets the standards for what to consider in a heuristic evaluation of an application. So sometimes we do engagements where we're just reviewing the UX of a product and helping the client understand where the UX is falling down. And we typically use that as a pattern. So it's a lot of things like, is the user always oriented as to what's happening, what just happened, what's going to happen, sort of some pretty basic UX principles that are often lacking in products. So So yeah, I mean, it's pretty easy to tie our work to that and say, have we accomplished all of the basic heuristics that are considered good product methods?
It's quite interesting because a lot of the work that we do with law firms, we tend to get involved when these validation and acceptance mechanisms don't exist. And I'm still surprised as to the amount of product that gets deployed in law firms that isn't tested at all or isn't tested thoroughly. And it's a bit of an interesting one because it's a challenge because it takes time, I think, and people see it as something that is not their job. And I wonder, do you guys see that a lot in your roles?
It's interesting. So one of the challenges that we have is, we write, when we're working on a task, we write a ticket that involve, the QA is involved in writing the ticket so that we define very clearly what the acceptance criteria is. And in a typical agency model, you wouldn't consider it fully accepted until your client accepts the criteria, that the criteria has been met. So first QA has to accept the criteria has been met, and then you don't go to final sign off until the client has said, yes, okay. We now completely skip that because our clients don't have time or energy or interest in reviewing those every release. So at the end of every sprint, they should be reviewing that. And so instead we sort of hand them the product and we say, do a run through and make comments and give us your feedback. And even then we have a hard time getting any sort of quality assurance feedback, anything. So what always happens is we get to the launch and they're like, wait, where did all these things come from? It's it's been sitting in there. You should have been testing it along the way. We've been telling you to, but we can't force them in the end. But I think it's a function of law firm innovation people being just really busy. And they pass the product on to us because they don't have capacity or time for it. But then, we see these huge jams that I think there was a story last year about Deloitte was hired for $30 million to build an application, and they were given all design decisions, all product decisions. And then at the end, it was not something that was usable to their client after spending $30 million. And so you can't be a hands-off participant in sort of determining quality, making sure that the needs of that what you expect to be there is there, but it happens so often.
Mm. Jay, how do you sort of encourage the right behaviours with people around acceptance and validation?
How do I encourage the right behaviours? Now, I can do my best at this point. So inventions at the minute, when it gets to acceptance testing and handing it over to operationalize, I've already passed the baton in part of my role. So part of my role is to generate the designs and the outline of what the solution is and understand what that problem is, and then I'll have passed those designs through to our R&D team that then tests that, like we just talked about. So it's a separate team with inventors that would do it, but I'm still trying to encourage the right behaviours right at the outset with me by getting them to understand why all the necessary steps are important. So the process is there for a particular reason. So I'm not going to sort of do what I do here and then sort of leave it to Johnny and his team in the R&D space to just go, right, let's set your expectations here around testing. It's like, well, why didn't you mention this right at the beginning? What's all this about? And part of the way that I try and influence people right at the beginning, up the stream of the process is, this is all to do with the end client in mind. You're thinking about doing something, maybe selling something yourself, but you've got to take your own perspectives, your own prejudices, your own opinions out of the equation and think about putting yourself in the shoes of the end user or the client. And it's that all the way through. So that's the philosophy of doing something. So those behaviors should be driven by empathizing with the user at every stage. And the way that we do that is, you're creating that persona and you're constantly going back to it by saying, have we solved this problem? Will this product, new service, new process, whatever it is, new business model, help this client here that we've got in our minds or that we're looking to target? And we do things like mood boards and other things, around, elements of that will be draw out quality in terms of what they expect, their expectations. So again, you're using things like that you've delivered already to help influence behaviors moving forward as well, to say, don't just forget about this stuff, hold on to it through the process with Johnny and the others. It's never easy.
There's a raft of technology solutions in the market for managing quality aspects like acceptance testing and providing data and capturing data on metrics as acceptance is underway. Have you guys got any favorite applications that you like to use, because there's a lot out there and some of them are pretty detailed and cumbersome to manage and maintain. I'm curious to know what you're using and if there's anything good worth people checking out.
I don't use anything. I don't know about you,
No.
Nicole. Give us an example of like what sort of things you mean.
Well, we often use TestRail for test management. So we actually have documented test cases, suites for different applications that we use when we're testing, and that gives you a really nice visual of pass-fail rates and things like that, and gives you that sort of data, which we find super useful because a lot of the time those things are either done quite manually within firms, which just means that there's a scalability issue with testing.
I would say we're probably still in that bucket then of having it issue right scale, because I think it is done manually at the minute. The reliance is heavily on our R&D team and the operational team that we hand off to in order to try and scale it there. So I think all that data gathering is done manually, and I think that's a problem when you look at this through a process improvement lens. Those Six Sigma sort of toolkits that can help out with process run charts, statistical process control charts, scatter charts, Pareto diagrams, histograms, all them things require data for you to put in. Now it is pain in the ass, to sort of put it bluntly, to try and then go, right, we need to measure this thing to put into this chart for it to tell us some answers on where our quality is. And then there comes a question of, if you're collecting this manually, does it outweigh the benefit of actually collecting it in the first place? And it's an age-old problem within legal in the terms of we don't have a very good data within inside law firms. And we like to think we have, but when it comes to start making changes where it's manually done, it can be quite difficult to measure quality at that sort of level.
Yeah, so I mean, we have technologies that we use, that we leverage like through the whole process of like user research, user testing, and then when we're actually building, we write automated tests like manually. A QA tester will run automated tests so that if something happens, it's everybody knows that there's something wrong with a deployment. So along that way, though, we use technology in very, I think I'm getting a little bit turned around because, we've been sort of conflating a bit validation and quality, which I think are a little bit different. In validation, certainly we leverage a ton of tools, especially now remotely when we have to do this work remotely. And I don't know if that's really what you're asking about.
No, please chuck it out there.
Great. So we have been leveraging Userlytics a lot for testing and validating consumer-facing products, because they will go out and do the recruiting for you, which is really one of the biggest challenges right now of finding people to test with. So they have a platform. Well, they'll go and recruit the users for you, and then you can create unmoderated walkthrough, and the users will record themselves sort of reviewing it and answering the questions and prompts. That has benefits and drawbacks. I prefer moderated ones. When we're working with lawyers, it's easier and harder to recruit those participants. It's much easier if the law firm client is willing to give us access to them, and then it's easy to get them on the phone. And with that, really like nothing beats just doing a Zoom call with a screen share, because then you can watch everything they're doing. They can have a conversation. You can ask follow-ups. So that's pretty basic and simple. We have used other tools like, if our problem really is in expressing trust or value on the landing page, there's an application called 5secondtest.com that'll just have people review your landing page for 5 seconds and then give your feedback and sort of tell back to you what they think the product does, which is, one of the biggest challenges of a landing page is conveying, this is what it does, this is the value, so click this first button. And then, of course, using site analytics will tell us a lot about how people are approaching the product and what the issues are. So we definitely leverage a lot of tools along those lines. Like for early workshopping too, we've been using Miro, but so much of our work is a bit more manual. So we will have these interviews. We'll take those interviews and we'll break down the information we got into sort of categories of feedback, and that's all done in an Excel spreadsheet. So then we can highlight, like, these are some of the core ideas, and then we can start like grouping things together and moving things around. So, an Excel spreadsheet really is our best tool for taking down feedback from users, grouping them, and, pulling insights from that.
Well, and this is the interesting thing, isn't it? There's no silver bullet There is a lot of hard work behind all of these processes that take place.
Yeah. Just to add in there off the top of my head is failure modes and effects analysis is something that we've used, and it's in the Six Sigma bucket. Again, if you're looking at something objectively from a standpoint, you're either looking to highlight or surface a problem within a process, that's a good one to do. So it's known as an FMEA, but it needs tweaking from what is the old manufacturing world into professional services, which I've had a stab at, because what you do is you're scoring the severity of the step. So you'll have your process steps of things that need to happen. And under each of these process steps, you'll have a list of things that could possibly go wrong. Okay, what could go wrong at this step? And you'll list all of those out. And for each one of those, you'll then give it a score on its severity out of 10. Now, in the manufacturing world, 10 is like, I've lost a limb, my arm, or my life. Where it's not going to be that bad in legal services, but that could be severe reputational damage, fine, non-regulated stuff. That's something that we need to do. It's a bad quality. So, but you're measuring severity in that first bracket. Then you're looking at the occurrence. So how often does this thing go wrong? And then you're looking at the last lens, the third lens, which is detection. How likely are we to detect this going, from going wrong? Is it sort of after the fact sort of thing? The horse has already bolted. Or do we have mechanisms in place inside our systems or manual interventions that help us spot something before it actually goes out? So is it something that's gone wrong when the client tells us, or is it something that we've caught in-house before it's got to a client, or we're not even seeing that at all? And you'll understand and measure that detection rate. And then you times each of those numbers up, and you'll end up with effectively like a risk score, so an RPN number, risk priority number. And what that will give you is, out of that process, that's something you should really target and focus on for your efforts to improve on, innovate out, develop, whatever that may be. It's a good little way of highlighting all the things that are wrongs, defective wise, within inside of your process. So that's just something that I thought of when you're measuring quality. It's a good way to start it.
Thanks, Jay. I think that's been very useful, and thanks to all of our collaborators that have been part of the Legal Meth Lab first series. We've covered a lot of ground over these 4 episodes. However, the full unedited version of the recordings is available via podcast. If you're interested, please get in touch with us. Equally, if you're interested in being put in touch with any of our collaborators, please let us know, and we're happy to make those introductions. We hope that you've found the content useful and that the conversations have helped to demystify technology and discipline within the legal industry.